Okay, can anybody shout out a word or a phrase that comes to mind when you think of digital tools? Synthesis, okay. Another one? Organization. Exploration. Sorry? Difficult, okay. Challenging, efficiency. One more. Quality. Okay, so lots of words flying around the place, and we will be touching on some of those as I talk today, but also as you go through the rest of today and the conference. I'm going to focus specifically on digital tools that are designed to facilitate qualitative and mixed methods analysis, specifically the software programs that are collectively referred to as computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages, or the acronym CAQDAS. In doing so, I'm going to make various comments about mindsets for engaging with these digital tools, and I'm going to suggest that we rethink how we think about them. I'm going to start off by making a few comments about the current landscape in order to place my recent work in context. And then I'll move on to outline the genesis of the pedagogy that myself and my colleague Nick Wolfe, who unfortunately can't be here today, have developed. It's a pedagogy that we call the Five-Level QDA method. I'll briefly outline the method and its principles before moving on to discuss the tools that we've developed in order to make unconscious processes that experts undertake explicit for other people to learn. I'm then going to share some of the ways that the method is being implemented by others and the opportunities that we believe it provides for developing curricula that integrate methodological and technological learning. I'll finish off by returning to the CAQDAS landscape and make a few comments about the future. As most of you will be well aware, software programs specifically designed to facilitate qualitative and mixed methods analysis have been available since the 1980s. These are not new technologies, and there are now many, many options to choose from. Initially, the programs available were rather different, having been developed in isolation with particular applications in mind. During the 1990s, when developers were competing to establish their market share, we saw convergence in the tools that the different products provided. Since then, though, many additional products have become available, and we are now seeing more divergence again, with many developers explicitly seeking to fill a perceived gap in functionality or to provide tools for specific types of analysis or user groups. I believe that this is a good thing, and I'm glad that no one program has emerged as the industry standard. The field of qualitative and mixed methods research is so diverse that to expect one product to be able to fulfill all of our needs for each and every project that each one of us undertakes, I believe is unrealistic. Those who attempt to be all things for all types of research, I believe, will likely fail. So what does the landscape currently look like? There are several ways that we could differentiate between products. And we may do this in order to provide an overview of them. First of all, we could differentiate along methodological lines, making statements about which programs are better suited for which types of analysis. There is certainly a great appetite for this type of commentary, and I am frequently asked which program is best for X, Y, or Z analytic strategy. But it's incredibly difficult to definitively make these kinds of statements. This is because there is a huge amount of variety in terms of the analytic tasks undertaken within particular methodologies, as well as between them. Alternatively, we could differentiate these products along technological lines in terms of operating systems. This is much easier because some products are only available on particular platforms, either Windows, Mac or Linux. Others are available on more than one platform, but have different functionality on each. Others are exactly the same on all platforms, and some are cloud-based, so platform is irrelevant. But however easy this way of differentiating might be, platform for most is only a practical consideration. It's an important one, but it's not the only thing to consider when we make a choice. We could also differentiate along collaborative lines in terms of how team working is enabled. This is also relatively straightforward. Some programs are cloud-based or have multi-user programs, and therefore several researchers can analyze the same data set at the same time. Other programs are single-user, but 2 or more projects can be merged together. And some programs are single-user and do not enable the merging of separate projects, so team members need to work sequentially. These practical factors are important for teams when making a decision between programs. But what happens when team members work at different institutions and therefore have access to or experience with different programs? At the moment, this is a significant issue, as it's not practically possible to exchange analysed data between CAQDAS programs. In my experience, such teams rarely resolve this issue by having all team members use the same program, because the individual researchers are wedded to the software that they have invested the time to learn. And more often than not, they don't want to use a different program for the duration of a specific research project. Unfortunately, this has potential significant implications on the process and outcome of collaborative projects, because some of the key benefits of using a dedicated CAQDAS program are lost when team members undertake different elements of an analysis in different programs and cannot combine them. Luckily, though, this is set to change in the future, and I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. We could also differentiate between packages according to how easy to use or how intuitive they are. These are very important considerations for individual researchers, because each of us has to feel comfortable about the tools that we use. Otherwise, we won't use them. But it's always going to be impossible to be definitive about which program is easiest or hardest to use, or which is more or less intuitive, because people learn differently and they have very different perceptions about what is intuitive or not. I'm often asked this question, and I can never answer it. All I can comment on is how it feels to teach each program, how much time is needed, and how quickly learners tend to get the logic of the program in terms of user interface and functionality. And of course, just because I might find one program easy to teach, it doesn't mean that learners experience it in the same way. These are just 4 of the ways that we could differentiate CAQDAS packages. Other ways might be to think about the types of data that are handled, or ways of visualizing the ideas that form the basis of our analysis, or ways of representing the results. But why am I even talking about differentiating CAQDAS packages? For 3 reasons. Firstly, because we now have so much choice, and navigating those choices, however complex it might be, is important. It's important for established researchers who haven't used digital tools in the past, who now want to consider using them. It's important for students and novice researchers entering our community of practice, because they need to understand both the variety in qualitative methodologies and the variety in the digital tools that are designed to support them. And therefore, it's important to those of us who are teaching the current and next generations of researchers. Secondly, it's important because the complexity of the terrain and the variety of options means that there is no one best CAQDAS program. Our research is varied, and therefore our needs regarding digital tools are also varied. Luckily, we have lots of options to choose from. Yes, it's complex, but we're not forced to fit into a particular mold, and that's something that we should value. Thirdly, because differentiating between CAQDAS programs, however we choose to do so, evokes mindsets, attitudes or ways of thinking about these digital tools. These are important to be aware of and to reflect upon. You might be wondering why I haven't made any comments about which programs are better for certain analytic strategies, or which programs work on which platforms, support collaboration in which ways, or which I find easiest to teach. Apart from the fact that it's not the purpose of my talk today to do this, it's also because each of these ways of differentiating operates on a continuum. Let's just take methodology as an example. If we place the purest qualitative approaches on one end, perhaps grounded theory is a good example, and on the other end of the continuum we place quantitative approaches to analysing qualitative data. There are several, but let's take content analysis as an example, and we could place all the other analytic approaches somewhere along this continuum. We could then make an assessment about which CAQDAS program facilitates which analytic strategy. This would be really messy, right? Because although it's true to say that some programs are better suited for certain analytic strategies, it's also true to say that some analytic strategies are very well supported by many or all CAQDAS programs. If we extend this idea of continuum out, we could differentiate. If we extend out all the possible ways of differentiating CAQDAS programs to the other continuum, we've suddenly got a really big mess, because the relative importance that researchers place on such criteria relates to the context of their needs much more broadly. So in terms of our own thinking about this, it's useful to think about where we sit on each of these continua and then think about choosing one or several programs, digital tools that can support all of our needs. Okay, before I move on to the main focus of my talk today, I just want to make a few brief comments about perceptions of CAQDAS programs, because it's an important part of the CAQDAS landscape. Despite the variety in the options that are available and the extent to which the digital world pervades most aspects of our personal and professional lives, the use of digital tools for qualitative and mixed methods analysis is still not a given. There are three groups of researchers with respect to the use of CAQDAS programs. There are advocates such as myself who have spent time learning one or more tools and have adopted them into their practice. In terms of mindsets, this group continually reflect on the role of digital tools within their research cycle. But then there are the critics. For a variety of reasons, there are many who criticize CAQDAS programs. It's not my purpose today to outline these criticisms or to rebut them. I just want to make the point that there remains a large contingent of researchers who intentionally do not use dedicated software programs to facilitate analysis, preferring general purpose tools or manual methods. However, if you're interested in the criticisms and their continued role in our field and the mindsets that underlie them, then I'd recommend a recent article by Christy Jackson, Trina Paulus, and Nicholas Wolff. In the middle, perhaps the largest group are those who are unaware of the existence of dedicated software for qualitative and mixed methods analysis. These might be established researchers who learnt analytic techniques before CAQDAS programs became widely available, or the burgeoning generation of new researchers who, if they're being taught by CAQDAS critics or the unaware, are also not being alerted to the fact that there are dedicated digital tools for analysis. The reason for distinguishing between these three groups has to do with our responsibilities to the current and next generations of qualitative and mixed methods researchers. I'm assuming that most of you here today are largely advocates, seeing as you're here attending a day dedicated to digital tools for qualitative research. Maybe some of you are not using CAQDAS programs at the moment. Perhaps you're here to find out more about them. Whatever the level that we each personally engage with CAQDAS programs, I believe we all have a responsibility for raising awareness of these tools, to enable researchers to make informed choices and to support them in their use should they decide to use digital tools. And I believe this is true whether we have a formal teaching role or not. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to describe to you the work that I've been doing over the past 5 years or so in developing the Five-Level QDA method. Before getting into the details, there are 3 key points to make. First of all, the Five-Level QDA method is a pedagogy. It's not a method of analysis, not an alternative to thematic analysis or discourse analysis or any other method of analysis, but it's a method of learning and teaching powerful use of CAQDAS packages. I'll explain later on what I mean by powerful use, but for now the important thing is that it's a pedagogy that transcends software programs, transcends methodologies, and transcends teaching modes. Second, the Five-Level QDA method is not a new or different way of doing analysis. What we've done is to unpack the unconscious processes that experts have developed over many years of trial and error so that new users can develop the expertise that they need for their projects, and so that they can do that quickly and easily. Thirdly, the Five-Level QDA method encapsulates a way of thinking, a mindset for thinking about the role of digital tools in the research process and how to get what we need out of them for our idiosyncratic analyses. Nick Wolf and I developed the Five-Level QDA method together. The theory he initially came up with, and when we met in 2013, we started working together to refine, test, and write about it. Answering the unwarranted critiques of the use of CAQDAS programs that I alluded to earlier was one of our drivers. We wanted to concretely illustrate that, for example, we can actually bring that the use of software can actually bring researchers closer to their data rather than distance them from it. That the use of these programs doesn't need to result in the homogenization of methods, and to illustrate that they do not take control away from us or encourage quantification in and of themselves. Addressing what we believe to be unwarranted critiques was important to us personally, because having worked for such a long time teaching their use, we find it frustrating that these criticisms are still around. But most important in terms of our task were the challenges that we've observed amongst researchers learning to use these programs. Many researchers who do embrace CAQDAS programs use them in a limited or superficial way. This can mean several things. For example, some mainly use the software as a data management tool, or they use it only for the straightforward stages of a project. Or they can't work out what to do after they've initially coded their data. Or they use it in a step-by-step way, perhaps following general advice about how a program should be used, a way that is not appropriate for their specific needs. Using these programs in a limited or superficial way isn't necessarily a bad thing, because not all projects require sophisticated uses. But often using a software in one of these ways is not intentional, and that is a problem. For example, many people who come to our workshops say that they know they're not using the software to its full potential. Therefore, using it in a limited or superficial way is a problem for them. What we wanted to do was to enable researchers to get what they need out of their chosen program. Closely related to this is cessation of use, meaning that what we've observed is that many researchers stop using a CAQDAS program right at the moment that it could be most useful to them. So, for example, it's extremely common for researchers to use these programs for straightforward or obvious tasks, such as coding, and then they switch to general purpose software, such as Word or Excel, or they go back to manual methods, highlighter pens and scissors, right at the moment that the tool could actually provide something additional. Something else that can happen is that researchers who are committed to using a program allow it to drive their process. What do we mean by this? Well, sometimes researchers will do something in the software because it seems convenient or because it's apparently easy, even if it's not quite what they need to do. It seems obvious from the screen, so they think they should be doing it. In this way, they allow the software to drive the process. We've seen lots of examples of this over the years, and this possibility is what underlies some of the critiques of CAQDAS program. The most extreme example I've come across is someone at one of my workshops recently who said that they'd started using the software because they heard that it was useful for doing a literature review. But they came along to my workshop because they couldn't really understand how that was the case. After speaking to this person for a while and looking at her project, I realized that she had imported more than 700 full-text PDF articles and generated thousands of codes. And after talking to her, I realized that those codes had been generated by searching for keywords. And she generated lots of data coded at these keywords, and she'd never even read any of the articles. And she somehow felt that if she just carried on coding, it would allow her to understand what was going on in the literature. I think we can all agree that that's never going to happen. It's an extreme example of letting the software drive the process, rather than thinking about what we want to do with our data and then choosing tools appropriately. So this story illustrates the dangers of letting the availability of the software features drive what we do with our data. This way of thinking is rarely productive, and it illustrates the importance of developing appropriate mindsets regarding the role and application of CAQDAS packages. Our development of the Five-Level QDA method sought to address these challenges so that researchers can learn how to harness their chosen program without going through many years of trial and error, and to do so in a way that is appropriate for their specific project characteristics and analytic needs. So let's move on and think about what Five-Level QDA actually is. I don't have time today to explain it to you in detail. You can get the detail from our textbooks and our other publications. What I want to do today is to outline the core principles and to give you an overview. The first principle is that strategies and tactics are distinct. In simple terms, strategies in any field are what we plan to do. In qualitative and mixed methods research, our strategies are driven by our project objectives and research questions. So it looks something like this. I don't know how well you can see the slide, but in academic research, our strategies, what we plan to do, comprise the objectives, which are the overall purpose and context of a project, which are usually expressed as research questions. And we choose or construct a methodology comprising data collection methods and analytic methods in order to fulfill those objectives. And all of that comes together in order to generate a plan of action. The point I'm making here is that although some of this work can be undertaken within a software program, the software program itself is not determining what our strategies are. Our strategies are distinct from our tactics. So let's think about what tactics are. Tactics are how we plan to do it, which in our context today means the tools that we have available to operationalize our strategies. This could be highlighter pens, whiteboards, general purpose software like Microsoft Word or Excel, or a dedicated CAQDAS program. Now, none of this is rocket science. The distinction between strategies and tactics is, of course, not something that Nick and I came up with, but the reason it's important in terms of mindsets for harnessing digital tools is because these terms are often conflated in the methodological literature. This quote from a textbook by the seminal author Alan Bryman is an illustration of that. He's using the terms strategy and tactic as if they are synonyms of one another. In fact, not much of the methodological literature even distinguishes between what we plan to do and how we plan to do it, but it's absolutely crucial in harnessing these programs powerfully to be clear that strategies and tactics are not the same. Why? Because in our field of work, they are not only different, but analytic strategies and software tactics, we believe, are contradictory in nature. Analytic strategies in qualitative and mixed methods research are to varying degrees iterative and emergent. And again, we can think about this on a continuum. So the purest qualitative inductive approaches are very, very iterative and emergent, whereas other approaches to analysis are less so. But it's a characteristic of everything that we do that there is a degree of iteration as we go through the process. What that means is that we don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. We can't plan an analysis in one fell swoop right from the outset. That's very, very different, those characteristics, from the characteristics or the nature of computer software. Because computer software is cut and dried. When we press a button in any program, something happens that is predetermined by the developer, and it happens in the same way every time. Okay, so that means that the outcome of a software operation is fully predictable in advance, and that is a tension between strategies and tactics. Now, this is not something that people think about explicitly, but it's our contention that this contradiction between the nature of our strategies and the nature of the tactics when we're using software as those tactics causes issues. And it's one of the reasons why people, for example, may stop using a software because they can't work out how to proceed. What I'm not saying is that people explicitly think, oh, my strategies and tactics are contradictory, therefore I'm going to stop working. People don't think explicitly like that, but unconsciously that's what's happening because there's an issue between the nature of what we want to do and the nature of the software that we're using. Now, in our books, we describe and explain this theory in detail, and we discuss different ways that the contradiction is unconsciously managed. And what we argue is that avoiding and compromising are two common ways, but are both problematic. I'm going to concentrate today on how the Five-Level QDA method enables this contradiction to be transcended, such that it's not problematic. But it's worth mentioning that avoidance can lead to limited or superficial use, or indeed cessation, and compromise can lead to allowing the software to drive the process. And that's what we believe unconsciously happens in many cases. But let's move on to what's more important, namely how this contradiction can be transcended. Now, remember, what we're doing here with the Five-Level QDA method is unpacking the unconscious processes that expert users of these programs have developed over many years. In other words, we've unpacked what goes on in their minds so that others can learn the process quickly and easily. I'll come back to how we've done this shortly, but now I want to show you what Five-Level QDA looks like. Unsurprisingly, it has 5 levels. 2 levels of strategy on the left-hand side, which are what I mentioned earlier, the overall objectives and the analytic plan. And 2 levels of tactics on the right-hand side that we call levels 4 and 5, which are the selection or construction of software tools. And in the middle is the level of translation. And our contention is that if you have a particular analytic task that you want to accomplish that you've developed at the level of strategies, then you go to your software, and hopefully the software developers, who are clever people, have anticipated your need to accomplish a particular task, and they've created a tool in order for you to accomplish that task. In that situation, we can just select the tool, accomplish our task, go back to our strategies and think about what we're going to do next. But because of the nature of the variety of all of our different needs, it's not feasible to expect that developers can possibly anticipate every single possible individual task that each and every one of us might want to accomplish. And that's where the sticking point often happens, is that we may have a task, but we can't obviously see a tool that's been designed for that purpose. And that's often when people panic, or they think that the software can't do what they need it to do, or they decide it's easier just to go back to their established manual methods. But what we have observed in expert users is that the creative use of the software means that it's almost certainly possible to accomplish a task. You've just got to work out how to do it. And that's what we call constructing tools. So the skill of harnessing these programs powerfully is about being able to use software in creative ways to construct what we need out of our software. And so that middle level 3, which I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly, is the process of translating the strategies into the tactics. But the key point about this diagram is that the direction of work goes from strategies to tactics, not the other way around. So we're not looking at the available software tools and trying to work out how we can use them. We're thinking about what are our needs and looking to the software and thinking about the different ways that we could accomplish them. Okay, so in order to unpack the black box of experts' processes, or in other words, to make the unconscious explicit, we teach that middle level, the skill of translation. Translation isn't a new or different way of doing qualitative data analysis, but it's a separate skill from planning the analysis or operating the software. And this separate skill needs to be made explicit and learned. We've unpacked the process into 5 steps, which are visualized here in the diagram. The first step is to identify the units in the task. So translation starts with a specific individual analytic task that we need to accomplish. And we encourage people to think about the units in those tasks. Now, units in qualitative research is something that are not very explicitly discussed often. In quantitative research, people tend to think about units much more explicitly because they need to think about units in order to think about variables. In qualitative research, units are just as important, but we tend not to explicitly think in those terms. In terms of translation, it's absolutely imperative to think about the units and to identify the units in a task, because it's those units that we use to decide how to operate the software. The second step is to describe the purpose of what we're doing. Now, it's very common that people will just do things because it feels like it might be a good thing to do, rather than thinking about what they're going to do next or why they're going to do it. So the horror story I gave you earlier is another good illustration of that. That person didn't think ahead in terms of what she was going to do with those codes once she generated them. She just generated them without thinking about purposes. And stepping back and thinking about why we're doing something is a useful task in all stages of our work. What we do once we've identified the units and described the purposes of a particular analytic task is we identify all the possible components in the software that could be used to represent those units. Now, I'm going to talk about components in more detail shortly, but just to continue with the overview of translation, once we've identified the possible components, and it's worth just being very clear that often it is the case that these programs are so flexible that we could use multiple different software components to represent the units of our particular task. We then have to therefore make a choice, and we use the purposes and the context of our task, specifically what we anticipate to do next, in order to decide which are the appropriate components for this particular task. And then we make a decision about whether we can just select a tool or whether we need to construct a tool in a more creative way. Now, this might feel very abstract, it might feel very elaborate and belabored, but that's just in order to explain, teach, and learn the process. Once the process is learned, which in our experience happens very quickly, it becomes internalized and unconscious. In terms of mindsets, translation is a heuristic process. In contrast to level 1 and 2, the overall objectives and the analytic plan, which are emergent processes. And in contrast to levels 4 and 5, selecting and constructing tools, which are algorithmic processes. When harnessing CAQDAS packages, researchers oscillate between these three different mindsets, the emergent, the algorithmic, and the heuristic mindset. And being explicit about that is something that is very, very important, because consciously recognizing that these different mindsets are occurring is at the root of how the Five-Level QDA way of thinking happens in terms of the nature, role, and use of these digital tools. Okay, so in order to teach a CAQDAS program using the Five-Level QDA method, we focus on the software's components and the actions that can be taken on them, rather than focusing on the software's features. A software feature is something that the program can do. And typically there are dozens and dozens of things that each software program can do. Features are what the developers focus on in order to describe to potential users how their program may be useful. But in our way of thinking, it's not productive to focus on features when teaching a program. Doing so is overwhelming. Learners get an overview of all the things that could be done, but they don't get very close to knowing what they're actually going to do if their teaching is focusing on the software features. And the horror story I told you earlier on is a potential outcome of focusing on features. Instead, we focus on the tangible components within the software, the things that can be acted upon in the service of our analytic tasks. The number of components varies according to each program, but there are typically between 12 or 15 components. Familiarizing with the software by focusing on components and what can be done to or with them, which is what we call the actions that can be taken on them, provides a high-level overview of the entirety of the software, but enables learners to understand how flexible the program is, and crucially, enables them to concretely think about which components they need to use in order to represent the units of their tasks and to accomplish their iteratively generated needs. We've developed various tools to teach translation, the most important of which are what we call analytic planning worksheets. Analytic planning worksheets scaffold the translation process. I haven't got time today to explain how they're used, but there are videos on our website that illustrate their use, and a template can be downloaded to use or to adapt. Okay, so having briefly been through the theory and the model, what about its implementation? Whilst we were writing our books, we went through several iterations of research and testing with students and established researchers who attended our training workshops, and with colleagues who themselves are expert users and teachers of different programs. The feedback that we gained from them contributed to the refinement of our pedagogy. Many others are now using the method in their own teaching. There's a couple here today who you may like to talk to about it. Some have adopted our pedagogy wholesale, whilst others have adapted it to suit their needs and contexts. It's being used in several universities around Europe, including the University of Copenhagen, Portsmouth, my own university, Surrey, and Lancaster. Also in America, in several universities as well. And earlier this summer, the first article reporting the use of Five-Level QDA in CAQDAS teaching that wasn't led by either myself or Nick has been published. The Five-Level QDA method is not at all prescriptive, but it's an adaptable framework for teaching and learning these digital tools. Our ultimate aim was to enable researchers to gain the expertise that they need for their analysis project as quickly and as easily as possible, without going through years of trial and error like we did. Just like there's no one process for undertaking qualitative data analysis, there's no one way of adopting the Five-Level QDA method. And we're therefore currently working on developing a Five-Level QDA community on our website where teachers can share their experiences and the teaching tools that they are developing. In developing the Five-Level QDA method, we took account of a variety of different CAQDAS programs, but we were only able to write 3 books at one time. Did think about doing 5, but thought that was a bit too much. We're currently talking with our publisher, though, about writing books for other CAQDAS programs, but we also believe that the method is applicable to other digital tools for qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods analysis. What I personally hope to see is the teaching of CAQDAS programs fully integrated into university curricula, rather than students only being provided short overview sessions or intensive workshop-based learning, and then being left to their own devices. Although there are some examples of integrated learning happening around the world, they are few and far between. And this, I believe, illustrates that there is still not a mindset that the theory of qualitative methodology, the strategies, and the practicalities of undertaking analysis using digital tools, the tactics, be taught together. This is something that I believe is no longer justifiable. Which brings me back round to the CAQDAS landscape and its future. As I mentioned earlier, I believe as a community of practice, we all have responsibilities to the current and next generations of researchers. As will be obvious by now, my personal focus in these terms relates to how we can most effectively teach appropriate and powerful use of dedicated digital tools. But it's also important to consider how our use of digital tools can contribute to illustrating the quality in our process. Historically, our community hasn't been very good at concretely illustrating how we get from a body of qualitative materials to an authoritative account or an interpretation. This is partly because it's difficult to show our process when working manually or using general purpose tools. But as soon as we use dedicated digital tools, we can concretely show what we did. And for me, this is one of the key benefits of using dedicated digital tools. As we know, technological developments are fast-paced, and I also think it's important that as a community of researchers, teachers, and developers, that we together anticipate and react to those inevitable changes. In some contexts, experts are no longer valued in the way that we once were, and this, together with the ever-increasing availability of digital tools for qualitative analysis, has potential implications on our role and practice. This is something that we need to reflect upon and address. Finally, I mentioned earlier the challenges of working collaboratively when undertaking analysis using CAQDAS packages, namely that it's currently not practically feasible to exchange analysed data between programs. But you'll be glad to hear that this is going to change pretty soon. For the last couple of years, developers from several of the major CAQDAS programs have been working together to develop an XML standard for exchanging analyzed data between products. The initiative was instigated by Janine Evers at the 2016 Qualon conference in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I'm lucky enough to be on the coordination group, and I'm very excited to be able to tell you today that we are now getting very close to having the first version of the exchange standard available. It's already possible to exchange code books between programs, and because the standard is open, other developers can and are implementing it. Once the full project exchange is released, it will be possible to export from one program into another in order to undertake analytic tasks not possible in the host program. The potential this has for the way researchers can work together, I think you'll agree, is pretty staggering. You can find out more by visiting the website, or you can grab me at some point during the conference or ask a question. So, in conclusion, as you enjoy this Digital Tools Day and the rest of the conference, I urge you to reflect on how you think about digital tools, their place in your practice, and what we can do together to enable appropriate and powerful use of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. It was really, really interesting, and I think that was a very interesting topic to start this conference, because as far as I understood, this is a topic that make us think more about what we are doing than just doing it. So I will explore it deeply, this methodology. Now I would like to open the session for questions, for comments also, because I think that I think that we have about 10 or 15 minutes, I think 15 minutes, because we have the coffee break at 11 o'clock. This is the goal of being here. So many researchers from several countries using different softwares with different approaches, and I think that when we are using a software, I think that we really think about what Christina Silver mentioned, this dialectic between the methodology and between the software himself, that sometimes the software takes the control of the process. So I just open the session for any questions, comments. Take the opportunity for having here Christina. Yes. I think, is there any microphone? No, but you can speak louder if you, okay. Oh, okay, thank you. So, over there, if you don't mind.
Good morning, ma'am. My name is Sritama Chaudhary. I'm from India. I'm a professor in sociology, and I do my research in ethnography. So my question is, in ethnography, we're supposed to do participant observation. So is there any way through softwares where we can measure or eliminate or assess our own personal biases while we are doing the ethnography? Because in community researches, many a times, while we are doing the field work, we find that our own biases are coming inside, and that is kind of affecting my fieldwork notes or my quotes or my mindsets or the quotes which I've written about the community. So is there any way how I can quantify my own biases so that I can eliminate it and make my research more objective? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting question. The software, no software can do that for you automatically, right? You have to be able to capture those biases in the field notes that you take or the data that you gather. But once you've able to capture those, then you can measure them in some way. And these programs allow you to quantify if you need to quantify, and some of them will allow you to do some statistical analysis on the quantification of qualitative data. But the first stage of that is to identify what those biases are and to capture them in some way in order that you can then do that. And that can happen on a, you know, the measurement of those biases can happen on a qualitative, interpretive level, but also on a quantitative level if that's what is deemed appropriate. But the software is never going to do that for you. You have to identify those biases and then capture them in order to be able to measure them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Some software is more inclined or less inclined to measure biases, or acknowledging the fact that biases are inherent in every observer?
I think biases are inherent in every observer, absolutely. But I think some softwares are more, have tools which allow you to quantify much more robustly than others, because some are coming from that side of the tradition, you know, in terms of that continuum of where pure qual, pure quant, and the software sits on that continuum. But I think it's a broader debate of the extent to which we want to measure and how that measurement happens, and that's methodologically contingent.
So you said step one was identifying units, right, in translation. Can you give us an example of various units, especially in the qual spectrum? So
when I teach this, I differentiate between 3 types of unit. So units of analysis, which are the kind of the main entities that form the basis of what we're analysing. So that may be individual participants or respondents. It may be an organisation. It may be a country, the core units of analysis. And I think qualitative researchers are generally quite good about thinking about units in that way. But I think it's also very useful to think about units of meaning. So, and that tends to be maybe the chunk of data that we attribute meaning to through our interpretation of it, whether that be through coding or through writing or annotating. So thinking about units of meaning, I would also think of a concept or a theme as a unit of meaning that we're using to attribute that meaning. And then we also differentiate between units of data, so the kind of the sort of more raw form that the data comes in. And those are kind of 3 types of units that we differentiate between, but they're not discrete, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So for one particular task, we might think of a unit in one way, and then that same unit might be thought of in a completely different way for a later task at a subsequent stage of the project. But I think units are really, really important, because in terms of software, we have to capture those units in the software in order that we can analyze them in some way. And that's where that whole piece about components comes in, because components allow us to capture units in different ways in order that we can then interrogate them.
Thank you.
Hello, Jenny Linden here from University of Surrey. Just to say thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, and also thank you because I benefited from your training at Surrey and didn't therefore have years and years of trying to find my way around the programme. My question is, now I've got to the stage of training rather than being the trainee, have you considered, or do you offer training for the trainer in this programme?
In Five-Level QDA, yeah, so that's something that we're working on at the moment. So I've done quite a lot of that informally with various different people around the world. We haven't yet done a formal sort of workshop on it, but yes, we're definitely moving towards that.
Hi, Lynn Jimison, Edinburgh. Thanks for that, and I'm hoping to get much more familiar with your work, which I feel I ought to have known very well already, but haven't, so I apologise for that. So my question is following on from the one before the last one, which is just, if it would be very helpful, I think, if you gave us an example of components. So I think a lot of people are familiar with NVivo, for example. What are the components?
Okay, so the reason I didn't talk specifically about that is because of the variety of programs. So let's just have some hands. Who knows or uses NVivo? Okay, what about Atlas TI? Max QDA? Web QDA? Transana? Okay, so components, most of the programs have a component which is a file or a source, a data file, yeah? And then a code would be a component. In NVivo, they used to be called nodes, and now they're called codes. And in Transana, they're called keywords. Then you have things like an annotation or a comment, which is a component. Then in some programs you have those shortcut collections of things. So in NVivo you have sets, in Transana you have collections, in Atlas TI you have groups, and they are ways of gathering together other components. And then there are components which are visual things, so a map or a model would be a component, or a chart. So those are sort of examples of components. And most of those components can be used in order to represent a particular unit that we need to capture in our analysis in order to be able to do that interrogation. Is that helpful?
Hello, my name is Carla, here. In a point, I just wanted to thank you very much for being here today and for the experience that you share with us. I was just thinking about something. You talked about challenges in gaining expertise, and in a point you said that the most people, the trainees, the most of them, they showed they had limited or superficial use of the digital softwares, and they wanted to be more proficient in that matter. But normally what we find is that people only use in the surface the softwares. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the point that is the most important one, which is to do the matrix and to get the final data, the results, they stop. Yep. In your opinion, why do people stop in the most important part of the process? Because they take a lot of time coding, mm-hmm. Reading the articles and coding and doing all those process, and when it comes to get the results, they just give up. It's because the curve of learning is too long. It's because they don't have the digital literature they need. Why is the reason, in your opinion? Thank you.
So what I think I said this morning was that part of the reason is that they don't know what to do next with the software. And that's to do with what you're talking about, is that maybe they don't invest the time to go further beyond what appears to be obvious, and what most of the literature talks about in terms of CAQDAS is coding. Coding is the easy bit in terms of, but I think, but behind that is a broader point about strategies, which is that, in my opinion, people don't plan or think ahead very much, and it's because they're not doing that they then don't realize what they could do with the software. And I think those two things are very, very closely intertwined. I think there's a sense in the community that because what we do is iterative and emergent, and because we can't plan out the whole thing right from the beginning, and we don't want to, because we want to let stuff emerge from all of that discourse around what we do, I think is problematic, because it means that people don't plan what they do, because they think that planning is going to constrain that free-flowing thing, rather than thinking, okay, my plans are going to change, my plans are going to evolve, but that doesn't mean I don't need to plan. So I think that the stopping point is often because they either think that the software can't do what they want it to do, which is almost always not the case, actually. So they sometimes blame the software and say, oh, this software's rubbish because it doesn't do what I need it to do, when actually it probably does, and it probably does it in 6 different ways. So that's the first thing. But you know, more importantly is that if you're not thinking ahead in terms of what you want to do on the strategies level, of course you're not going to be able to work out what to do on the tactics level. So I think that's a bigger piece. You know, our aim with Five-Level QDA was very specific to try to address this point exactly. But I think we've realized along the way, and in terms of the feedback we've had from our own students and colleagues around the world, is that strategies piece is actually a really big piece that isn't properly dealt with. So that's also something I want to think about in the future, about how we can, you know, teaching the two methodology and technology concurrently allows those 3 mindsets that I was talking about to be explicit about that and see that planning is not a constraining thing but an enabling thing.
Hi again. When talking about strategies and tactics, you use the phrase fully predictable about clicking on buttons. And I just wonder what you mean by that. Could you elaborate? Because I build buttons and I sometimes don't know what they're going to do.
No, you might, as a user, we might not know what's going to happen. But if I press on a button in your software, then something will happen that is predetermined, that I have no control over. Correct? No? I would disagree with that. Okay. All right. Well, we can have a conversation about that.
Hi, Safari Ombaleka from the Philippines. I come from the Asian Qualitative Research Association. Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to go back quickly to the question of my colleague from India, where she was talking about objectivity. Mm-hmm. I think there's more philosophical aspect to that question than just the technical part. Mm-hmm. The technical part, can we actually measure this and put it in software? But I think the philosophical part of it is that we don't intend to remove bias the way we do it in quantitative research when we deal with qualitative research. And this is the reason why we need the researcher's reflexivity or researcher's positioning. And I hope that can be clarified. Just a quick question I had for you was, you mentioned the list, the characteristics of good qualitative research software. And I saw a lot of comparison between your list and that of Cresswell 2013. The only thing that was different was the comparison between the software and the research design. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing that I found there. And for that purpose, I wanted to know if you have come up with a table that can propose each software and the design that it goes with. I think we have something like that, practical like that, it will be very, very helpful.
I've been asked to do this many times over the years, and I've tried it in various ways, but because, you know, so that slide with all those different continua on, it's almost impossible to do that in a concrete, meaningful way, because each program sits in a different place for each one of those things. And more than that, you know, for example, you might want to say that one program is really well suited for narrative analysis or discourse analysis. But what discourse analysis means is so variable even amongst discourse analysts. So you would have to break it right down. And so therefore, what we do with Five-Level QDA is we break it down to the analytic task. So an analytic task is a discrete, concrete thing that I might want to do. So as a simple example, I might want to open code the first 10 transcripts, right? That would be a specific analytic task. Now, obviously, the overarching methodology that leads to me needing to do that task is really, really important. But at the moment that I need to accomplish that task, it doesn't matter whether I'm doing discourse analysis or grounded theory or thematic analysis. The task, at the moment that the task is accomplished, is in and of itself just a task. Does that make sense? So individual tasks, so people do open coding if they're not doing grounded theory, for example. So I think it's really, really, really difficult to categorize CAQDAS programs on any of those continua, but you have to do it on all of them for it to be meaningful, and then you just get in a big mess. So that's why it's never been done, because I think it's impossible to do in a way that's not more confusing. Sorry.
One more question, and if you don't mind, we go to coffee break, and then we can continue talking during the coffee break. Yeah.
I'm not usually good at being quick, so do you? I mean, I get that on the general, that generally talking about projects or whatever, but do you believe that on the specific, you can be much more like, but you've got to because I think that's the key thing. You've got to understand what does somebody mean by discourse analysis, rather than saying this one's better.
Yeah.
It's like for your project.
Yeah. So if you were to say to me, I want to do this, then I could say, okay, well, if you chose this program, then it would look like this, and this could subsequently happen. If you chose that program, or if you chose this program, you couldn't do it. I can talk on that level and specifics, but I don't know how, I mean, that's helpful for individuals and teams who are actually working, but how helpful that is in terms of people who are new to the area, I think that that's too fine-grained to introduce people generally.
Coffee.
So, thank you very much. I have a question for Christina, but during the coffee break, because I didn't have the... Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Christina.